The dust was the first profit of our end. It began as a fine, pale powder that settled on every surface, a constant shroud that tasted of failure. The land, once generous and dark, had turned against us. Fields that had given life for a generation cracked into a mosaic of ruin, the soil crumbling to ash between our fingers. The blight had come and gone, but it left behind a deeper sickness in the ground itself, a barrenness that prayers could not heal. They needed someone to blame, and I was the perfect vessel for their fear. I was the widow of a man who had loved the earth too much, who had filled notebooks with drawings of roots and rocks instead of ledgers of profit and loss. Thomas had been strange, and in their grief, the people of Providence decided his strangeness was a curse he had left behind, a poison seeping from his books into the soil. I remember the meeting in the town hall, the air thick with the scent of stale sweat and desperation. Reverend Miller stood before them, his voice a hammer striking the anvil of their terror. Her husband meddled with things man was not meant to know, he declared, his finger pointing not at me, but at the memory of Thomas. He filled her head with his unnatural philosophies. This land is barren because it has been defiled by prideful knowledge. They didn't look at me, not directly. They looked at my hands, my dress, the worn leather-bound journal I clutched to my chest, the last piece of him I had. They saw a ghost, a remnant of the man they now despised. I said nothing. There were no words that could penetrate the wall of their certainty. I was young, a woman alone, and my silence was mistaken for guilt. They didn't cast me out with stones, but with a cold, unified turning of their backs. I was to leave by morning. I was the blight now. I walked away from Providence as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the dead fields in hues of fire and sorrow. I carried little more than a water skin, a small sack of dried jerky, and his journal. Its weight in my hands was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved around me. Every step took me further into the Badlands, a place of stark and brutal beauty that the townsfolk avoided. But Thomas had loved it. He had spent months out here, mapping the canyons, studying the strata of the rock, convinced that the answers to life were not in the sky, but deep within the stone. The world breathes, Annalise, he used to whisper, his fingers tracing lines on a map that looked more like the veins of a living creature than a depiction of terrain. It has lungs, a heart. We just walk on the skin, too blind to see the systems working beneath us now. His words were my compass. The journal was filled with his elegant, spidery script, detailing not just what he saw, but how he saw it. He wrote of water that flowed in hidden rivers beneath the dust, of soil born not from decay on the surface, but from minerals pushed up from the planet's core. He believed the surface was only a temporary expression of a much deeper, more resilient truth. He had mapped a specific location, a place he called the Limestone Heart, a cave system tucked away in the foothills. To others, it was a worthless hole in the ground. To him, it was a sanctuary of possibility. As the last silhouette of the town vanished behind me, I felt a strange calm settle over my fear. They had cast me out for being too smart, for holding on to the knowledge of a man they called a fool. But perhaps his foolishness was the only thing that could save me now. The entrance was almost invisible, a narrow fissure in a sheer cliff face, hidden by a curtain of ancient, petrified scree. It was exactly as Thomas had sketched it on page 47 of his journal. I had to crawl to enter, the rough stone scraping my hands and knees. The air that flowed out was cool and damp, carrying a scent I'd never known before, the smell of deep earth, of stone and water and millennia of darkness. Inside, the passage opened into a chamber that stole my breath. It was not a simple cavern, but a cathedral of geology. Water, rich with dissolved minerals, dripped from the ceiling, forming delicate, pale structures that glittered in the faint light from my lantern. A stream, clear and silent, flowed through the center of the chamber, disappearing into another dark passage. This was his geological lung. The journal described how the porous limestone filtered both air and water, creating a unique, stable environment shielded from the harsh realities of the world above. I followed the stream deeper into the network, my small light pushing back an immense, patient darkness. After nearly an hour, I found it. The cavern he had written about with such reverence. It was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, but the floor was a miracle. It was covered in a layer of soil, black and rich and teeming with unseen life. He had explained it all in his notes: centuries of back guano from the colonies high above, mixed with mineral deposits from the water and the slow erosion of the limestone itself, had created a perfect, self-renewing loam. It was a secret garden, hidden in the bones of the earth. Here, in this profound darkness, shielded from the sun that had scorched my home to dust, was the most fertile ground I had ever seen. Hope, I realized, was not a thing of the light. It was a seed that could germinate in the deepest dark. The work was a prayer made of muscle and sweat. My world shrank to the confines of the cave and the small, sun-drenched basin just outside its entrance, a natural bowl of rock that would protect my efforts from the wind. Day after day, I filled burlap sacks with the precious cave soil, my shoulders screaming as I hauled them back into the light. The contrast was a physical shock every time, from the cool, damp, living dark of the cave to the hot, dry, dead air of the Badlands. I was a bridge between two worlds, transferring life from one to the other. As I worked, the voices of Providence echoed in my memory. Reverend Miller's sanctimonious pronouncements, the whispers of the women who once called me friend. She reads too many books, they would say. Her head is full of her husband's nonsense. A woman's place is in the home, not in a library of dirt and rocks. They saw knowledge as a sin, curiosity as a rebellion against the natural order. But Thomas had taught me that the natural order was knowledge itself. He had taught me to read the story written in the stones, to understand the language of water and soil. He saw the world not as a fixed creation to be feared, but as a living system to be understood. Tucked away in a sealed recess of the cave, just where his journal said it would be, I found a small clay pot. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry moss, was a handful of seeds. They were wheat, but unlike any I had seen before, the kernels were darker, almost red, and felt heavy, dense with potential. His notes called them ancient Goldra, a strain he had spent years cultivating, cross-breeding for resilience, for the ability to draw life from mineral-rich soil. He had left them for a future he never got to see. For me, planting them felt like an act of defiance. I laid out the soil in shallow beds, mixing it with the crushed, sandy dirt of the basin to give it structure. I carved small channels with my hands, diverting a trickle of water from the cave's internal spring to create a slow, steady irrigation system. Every movement was deliberate, guided by the principles in Thomas's journal. He wrote about the partnership between water, soil, and seed, a trinity of creation. He believed that forcing the land was an act of violence. The key was to listen to it, to give it what it needed, and then to stand back and allow it to work its own quiet magic. I placed each seed into the earth as if I were burying a jewel. For weeks, I watched and waited. The sun beat down on the basin, and I feared the heat would be too much, that the life I'd carried from the dark would shrivel in the unforgiving light. I slept at the mouth of the cave, rising with the dawn to check my small, desperate field. Then, one morning, I saw it. A line of the faintest green, a fragile but determined declaration of life pushing through the dark soil. The shoots were thick and vibrant, a deeper shade of green than any I had seen in the fields of Providence. They did not look like they were merely surviving, they looked like they were thriving. In that moment, watching those first blades of wheat reach for the sun, I felt Thomas's presence more profoundly than ever before. He wasn't a ghost haunting me, he was the intelligence guiding me, the wisdom in the soil, the resilience in the seed. This small patch of impossible green was his final argument, and it was irrefutable. I was not just growing wheat, I was cultivating proof. In Providence, the autumn air grew teeth. A premature cold snap settled over the valley, and the dust that coated everything now mingled with a persistent, chilling mist. The town was a portrait of quiet starvation. The reserves from the last good harvest were gone, and the hunting parties came back with less and less. Faces grew gaunt, and the children's laughter, once the town's most reliable music, had fallen silent. Sheriff Brody felt the town's despair as a physical weight on his shoulders. He was a man of simple truths and tangible evidence, and the town's turn on Annalise had never sat right with him. He hadn't believed in the curse, but he hadn't had a better explanation, either. Now, doubt was a bitter taste in his mouth. He remembered Thomas not as the dangerous eccentric the Reverend described, but as a quiet, observant man who could stand in a field for an hour, just watching, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. He remembered Annalise's dignity in the face of their judgment, the unwavering clarity in her eyes. It was a look not of guilt, but of a sorrow too deep for anger. One morning, driven by a gnawing sense of duty and a flicker of shame, he saddled his horse. He told no one where he was going. He just said he was scouting the upper canyons for game. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Perhaps her camp, abandoned. Perhaps nothing at all. He followed the faint tracks she had left months ago, guided by a lawman's instinct and a memory of a map Thomas had once shown him, a map of the Badlands he'd called his true country. He rode with a heavy heart, bracing himself for the worst, for a confirmation of the town's brutal, self-serving prophecy. He found her near dusk, the low sun casting long shadows that made the canyons look like sleeping giants. At first, he didn't see the field. He saw only her, kneeling by a small, steady fire near the mouth of a cave. She looked thinner, her face weathered by sun and work, but her posture was not one of defeat. When she looked up and saw him, there was no fear in her eyes, only a weary recognition. He dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping the area, and then he saw it. Tucked into the rock basin, protected from the wind, was a patch of gold. It was a small field, no bigger than a town plot, but it was dense with the healthiest, most vibrant wheat he had ever laid eyes on, the heads heavy and full, bowing under their own weight. The sight was so impossible, so utterly contrary to the dead, grey world he had just ridden through, that for a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He walked to the edge of the basin, the scent of ripe grain and rich earth filling his lungs. It smelled like life. He reached out and touched a stalk, the kernels hard and real beneath his fingertips. He turned to look at her, his throat tight with a dozen questions that all condensed into a single, whispered word. How? She didn't offer a long explanation. She simply beckoned him to follow. She led him into the cave, lighting a lantern. She showed him the vast chamber, the black soil, the hidden stream. She opened Thomas's journal and pointed to the diagrams, the notes on geology and hydrology, the patient, scientific observations. He saw not witchcraft or divine intervention, but a brilliant, logical system. He saw the years of tireless work Thomas had put in, and the courage and resilience Annalise had used to bring it to fruition. He had come expecting to find a victim. Instead, he found a savior. Sheriff Brody returned to Providence 2 days later. He didn't ride in shouting a miracle. He walked into the town hall during the evening council meeting, a heavy burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He dropped it on the table with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. He untied the top and let a stream of golden wheat pour out, the kernels piling into a small, perfect mound on the rough-hewn wood. A collective gasp went through the room. The grain was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was perfect. Reverend Miller was the first to speak, his voice laced with suspicion. "Where did you get this?" The sheriff looked at him, his gaze level and unyielding. From Annalise the name fell into the room like a stone into a still pond. Disbelief turned to anger. "It's a trick," one of the councilmen muttered. "She's trying to poison us." Dr. Alastair, a man whose pragmatism outweighed his piety, stepped forward. He ran his fingers through the grain, brought a few kernels to his nose, and then, to everyone's shock, put one in his mouth and chewed it thoughtfully. He was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. "This is the finest wheat I have ever seen. There is no poison here. There is only life." Reverend Miller scoffed. "She consorts with the earth in unnatural ways. This is the devil's harvest, meant to tempt us to our doom." But his words, once so powerful, now sounded hollow. The evidence was right there on the table, a pile of undeniable, life-giving truth. The sheriff let them argue, his silence a more potent weapon than any shout. He had seen the system. He had seen the work. He was a believer now, and his conviction was a quiet, unshakable force in the room. The seeds of doubt had been planted, not in the soil, but in the minds of the people of Providence. The first snow came not as a gentle blanket, but as an icy sheet, driven by a relentless wind. It sealed the town in a tomb of white. The last of the salted meat was gone. The meager stores of dried beans and shriveled potatoes were nearly exhausted. The hollow knock of hunger was at every door. Fear, cold and sharp, finally broke their pride. It was Dr. Alastair who spoke for them, approaching the sheriff with a small, humble delegation. Their faces were etched with desperation. There were no more accusations, no more talk of curses. There was only the raw, animal need to survive. The next morning, a small party of men, led by the sheriff, made the trek into the Badlands. When they arrived at Annalise's basin, they stopped, their breath misting in the frigid air. They stared at the small, harvested field, at the neat stacks of wheat sheaves she had piled against the rock wall. They looked at her, standing at the cave entrance, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a profound and weary calm. She did not speak of their cruelty or their foolishness. She simply handed them empty sacks. "The grain is in the upper chamber, where it's dry," she said, her voice even. "The rest is still on the stalk. It needs to be threshed." She showed them the system, the dark, fertile earth of the cave, the clear water of the hidden stream, the genius of Thomas's design. They saw the blisters on her hands. They saw the years of research in his journal. It wasn't a miracle. It was work. It was knowledge. It was listening to the world instead of shouting at it. As they began the slow, arduous task of threshing the wheat in the biting cold, a new understanding dawned on them. The land had not turned against them. They had turned their backs on the land, refusing to see the complexity and resilience that lay just beneath the surface. That winter, no one in Providence starved. The wheat from the cave, ground into flour, was rationed carefully, a sacrament of survival. Each loaf of bread was a testament to the woman they had exiled. When spring finally came, melting the snow and revealing the wounded earth, they did not plant with blind faith and old habits. They came to me. I taught them what Thomas had taught me, how to mix the cave's living soil with their dead earth, how to read the needs of the land, how to see the world not as a resource to be conquered but as a partner to be respected. The first new harvest in the valley was not abundant, but it was alive. It was a start. It was a promise. I never moved back to the town. I stayed by my cave, in the heart of the Badlands that had become my sanctuary. They would come to me for guidance, their hats in their hands, their pride replaced by a quiet, earnest curiosity. The land began to heal, and in doing so, the town began to heal, too. I often stand at the edge of the basin, looking out over the valley as it slowly returns to life, and I think about the nature of worth. They cast me out for being too smart, but it was never about intelligence. It was about perspective. They were looking for answers in the sky, while the solution was always waiting, silent and patient, beneath their feet. And maybe that's the lesson for you, too. Perhaps the thing you've been told is worthless, the barren ground, the strange idea, the part of yourself you've been taught to hide in the dark, is the very place where true life is waiting to begin. Perhaps you don't need a miracle. You just need to be willing to dig,